Hello and welcome to our webinar today. We're going to be talking about international schools, innovation and response to the COVID pandemic. I'm Fiona Murchie and I'm now going to hand you over to today's host, Jayne Constantinis.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Yes, a very interesting and stimulating topic today, part of this month-long great international education and schools fair, which of course is broader than pure education. We're also talking about relocation and global mobility, employee well-being and future fit workers and workforce. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers for you this morning. In a moment, we're going to hear from Ashwin Assomull, who's a partner at L.E.K Consulting. In fact, he's the founder member of the firm's education practice and head of the Mumbai and Singapore office. We're also going to hear from Jayne Constantinis, also from L.E.K, partner at of the global education practice, in fact, founding member and leader of that practice. He's got extensive experience across all education segments and is now focused on education work in the UK, Australia and Latin America. We also have Jonathan Taylor with us this morning, principal of International School Zurich North, Cognita's first school in Switzerland. He's got 20 years in UK and international education, 11 of them in senior leadership roles. David Willows, PhD, won't be talking about jam making. He might be if we ask him nicely. He's going to talk about his work as Director of Advancement at the International School of Brussels in Belgium. And he has a very varied career as an academic, teacher, writer and speaker and at the moment jam maker. And of course, Fiona, who you just heard from, is with us, managing editor of Relocate magazine, Relocate Global and Think Global People. And Fiona is an expert in global mobility and international workforce management. So we have a lively and interesting conversation in prospect. And to set the scene for us and get us started, I'd like to hand over to Ashwin.
Thank you very much. And a real pleasure to be here. We've been very fortunate to work with Relocate magazine in the past few years, sharing perspectives on international school markets across the world, the opportunities for schools, but also for parents and how they should think about what's the right thing to look for when choosing a school. I think there are some slides that hopefully I can get access to, Fiona, which I can see right now. Let me start with a very brief introduction to L.E.K. We're a strategy consulting firm headquartered in London, but with a very global footprint. We focus really on strategy and helping governments and corporates with growth and investors. And I'm part of the education practice, which is headquartered out of Singapore, but covers the whole world of education. And probably 60% of our work is in the world of K-12, in schools, helping investors, operators, schools expand into new markets, and helping governments regulate and control that sectors to ensure parents get the right mix of quality, choice, and value for money. So we've done a fair amount of work, especially in the Middle East, around helping governments with those factors. And it's this sort of very global view where we're able to work in Latin America, across Europe, Africa, Middle East, all across Asia, up in China and down to Australia and up to Japan, where we do a lot of primary research. We talk to lots of operators, we talk to lots of parents that informs some of the views that we'll be sharing with you today. So parents today actually have some of the best offerings in the world today. So if you're leaving the UK, you have a real myriad of options, whether it's the global operators, such as Cognita, who operate schools as part of their business, and they do this all over the world. International schools partnerships, these may not be household names to you if you're in the UK, but internationally, these are groups that are very well known and operate anything where between 10 and 60 schools, and running schools is their business. So you've got that on offer. You've got the British brands that have gone abroad. Some of them will be known to you. The likes of Harrow and Dulwich are probably most famous, Brighton College. And all of these brands have moved abroad with a local partner, but have used the expertise and the experience of the home campus to help equip the schools in the markets that they're serving, whether it's in Dubai or in Dalian. But you also have a whole host of local brands, which you mustn't discount. There's some really good schools that are running in places like Southeast Asia, even in the Middle East, that are homegrown brands brought together by local investors and local operators and bringing in some of the world's best practice. So you've got the likes of Aldar Academies that operate in Abu Dhabi, Talim in Dubai, and Taylors in Malaysia. And these are school brands that you wouldn't have heard of. But when you go to those markets locally, you'll understand that they are very well regarded and they give parents a really high quality product in terms of the education offering and also in many cases value for money. So when we've surveyed parents in the past, it's, there's literally tens of thousands of parent surveys that we do across the world every year. Typically the feedback that we get is, look, it's, reputation's important, fees are important, but the most important thing really is we want to choose a curriculum that makes sense. So typically, if you're from America, you tend to choose an American curriculum because you want to go back. If you're from Britain, you tend to choose a UK curriculum because you want to be able to settle back easily when you go back to the UK. But academic quality is the thing that parents are typically looking for. And they find it quite hard to articulate what that means. But some of them think of it in terms of quality of teachers. Some of them think of it in terms of academic outcomes, but how they assess that, it's very difficult for them to put their finger on. I mean, in the UK, when you're looking at a choice between independent schools in the place that you live, of course, location is important, but then you're going to look at something like the Good Schools Guide. You're going to look at the performance of the school in terms of the GCSE performance and where they rank on the A-level tables, the university destinations. So that information is really quite easily available in a market like the UK. In some of these markets where expats are relocating to, it's quite tough to get that information, and parents rely a lot on hearsay, word of mouth, discussions with other parents, visits to the school, which of course are very important to help understand what the school's like, discussions with the teachers, but there's nothing really sort of tangible in terms of a one-stop shop to get a view of how one school ranks against another. So selection criteria, are focused on academic quality. Of course, other issues around safety and security and some of these other factors are important. But increasingly in a post-COVID world, having surveyed probably about 3,000 parents in the last 3 months, and all of these parents are parents that are in these international markets, a few things come to mind. The first is the quality of online and remote learning. And it's interesting that when we've surveyed parents, the level of satisfaction that they had with the online learning has actually been quite high and higher than expected in many markets. But that's also because they didn't know what to expect and they don't know what really good looks like. But the best schools are really stating their value proposition in terms of what they can deliver on online and hybrid learning if we were to go back into a lockdown in Dubai or in Singapore and Hong Kong. And as we're seeing in Europe, that is definitely a possibility. So it's not as if online was something that they had to deal with in the last few months. It's something that schools will need to continue delivering on over the next year, 2 years, 3 years, and maybe beyond, because parents will want to see how they're going to embed technology in the way they deliver the curriculum to their students. Of course, what's really important to parents now, when we speak to school operators who are trying to recruit more parents and get more parents through the doors, what they're saying is that they really need to explain the health and safety protocols that are in place for the time during this pandemic. Schools are finding it difficult to ensure that the spread of COVID is limited, and the rules and regulations around this vary from country to country. But schools are doing a pretty good job, in my view, trying to explain how they've put in the right systems and how their infrastructure allows them to support social distancing. And in fact, some of the schools that are newer and are not full are using that as a way to attract parents to say, look, we're actually not operating at 20 to a class. We have, we're only at 10 to a class, and that means we can social distance much more effectively. So health and safety related to COVID is very, very important. I think the other thing that we're hearing from parents and from the operators is this focus on pastoral care. And we know Cognita have done a pretty good job on focusing on mental health for their students, but it's also mental health for teachers and parents. And I think that's increasingly important in a time when we're all locked up, staring at a Zoom screen and dealing with all the difficulties that come with parents working from home, kids spending part of their time in school, part of their time at home. And then one of the things that also comes up is the financial sustainability. So increasingly, there's a question mark around single site schools owned by mom and pop operators. Will they be around in 2 to 3 years? When you see a decline in enrollments in a market that is seeing an exodus, maybe some of the expats are leaving, does a school that doesn't have the deep pockets of a big chain behind it, can they survive the drop off in enrollment? So that is really was my last point. But parents have traditionally focused on academic outcomes. Those are still important, but there are a whole host of other issues that are becoming now very important as parents consider schools when they're choosing the right school for their child. So I'll stop there, Fiona and team, and I'll hand back to you, and happy to open this to a panel discussion.
Great. Thanks very much, Ashwin. A really, really interesting perspective there. I wonder if I can ask Jonathan to lead on the first topic area that I'd like to cover. And it's actually turning the clock back a little bit. What are the challenges? What were the challenges that the COVID pandemic brought about for schools?
I think that has changed and evolved over time, to be honest with you. When the COVID first arrived, it was the uncertainty, it was the major challenge. Nobody quite knew how this was going to play out. And I'm here based in Switzerland, and I remember sending texts to friends in the UK and family saying that this was going to be big. And at the time, it hadn't quite reached the UK. And I vividly remember now just almost that naivety of 6 months ago, as this tidal wave was arriving, but it was only when it was right at the beach that people could recognise that. And I think
what are the challenges? What were the challenges that the COVID pandemic brought about for schools?
I think that has changed and evolved over time, to be honest with you. When the COVID first arrived, it was the uncertainty, it was the major challenge. Nobody quite knew how this was going to play out. And I'm here based in Switzerland, and I remember sending texts to friends in the UK and family saying that this was going to be big. And at the time, it hadn't quite reached the UK. And I vividly remember now just almost that naivety of 6 months ago, as this tidal wave was arriving, but it was only when it was right at the beach that people could recognise that. And I think the challenge that we had, if we go back to sort of February, March time, was not knowing what was coming next. There was a sense that we had to close the schools down, but we didn't know how long we were going to have to close them for, what it was going to look like when we reopened. And I think dealing with that sense of panic and uncertainty was certainly from a leadership perspective, was a big challenge. I think the fact, from my school in particular, we placed a big emphasis on digital literacy from when I arrived sort of 18 months ago in post. So we were quite well placed to transition to remote learning. And I think we did that well. It's something we're very proud of. But I think it was a variable response to that in terms of international schools. And I speak to colleagues who say they were just wholly unprepared for that. And when the school closed down, the first 3 days, we're actually training the teachers rather than doing anything with the students. So I think that was the original challenge. I think since then, and it was really interesting listening to what Ashwin said, that fits in exactly with my experience that parents are now increasingly interested in our approach to health and safety in terms of how we're managing COVID and our general philosophy towards it. I think the reopening and the sustained sort of staying open now is very much around operational safety. And I think one of the key issues that is going to be ongoing for school leaders is this idea of almost nimble planning and flexibility. Long-term planning, that's on hold for a while because regulations are changing day by day, situations changing day by day, and I think flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances is both one of the biggest challenges that we face at the moment, and probably also how school leadership and what is effective school leadership has changed.
I want to come on to the topic of leadership a little bit later, but David, I wonder if you'd give us your thoughts on whether you agree that the challenge initially was uncertainty and now it's become much more practical about operational issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there's some great points being made that really resonate a lot with our experience in Brussels. The thing about uncertainty is when you're facing it, most of the time what we do is we look back at the past to make that uncertainty less frightening. And I think that one of the challenges that many of us would probably identify with here is there was no playbook for this. So in all aspects of school, we suddenly found ourselves in a position where so much in one moment in time was up for grabs. And certainly if you just look at something like the prediction of enrollment based on historical trends, there were no historical trends that would allow us to really, model and reassure, our school boards or our colleagues or other parents, where this was taking us. And I think this is one of the challenges that I think we were facing in those early days. And I think one of the things we're now back in a situation where we are now in a second lockdown, a second period of distance learning, and to be honest, it's come earlier than many of us had anticipated, and so that some of those things are now happening for the second time, and we have something to fall back on, but it feels very different to that first experience of the lockdown. Interestingly, our students have adapted very quickly and immediately. But I think there's a general sense that the challenges moving forward are going to be maybe more challenging than that first adjustment to this new reality. Our enrollment didn't go down. Our distance learning program was successful, but I think on the horizon, and we may come to this later on, I think some of those future challenges maybe where we're seeing some seismic shifts in what we mean by international education.
Yeah, we definitely will look at the future towards the end of this conversation. Jayne, no playbook, obviously, but as David said, some experience of dealing with these issues. What's been your observation of how the challenges have evolved over the last 8 months?
Yeah. I think some very good points are definitely being made about how things were uncertain. I think overall, when you look at the current situation, some of the uncertainty that's still associated with, when are these lockdowns going to come in place? How are the governments going to react? So, like, if you talk about UK or what's been happening in Europe, there has been a little bit more transparency. The government's taken a little bit more control. Similarly, in Singapore. But if you look at some of the markets like in the Middle East, or if you look at Mexico, there has been a very different take that the government has action, right? So they have, for example, schools have been closed for extended periods of time. They've had to continue staying in this online mode. So the challenges differ region by region. But I think what I would definitely like to emphasize on is that uncertainty required some amount of call to action, and everybody, school administration, teachers, parents, got behind that action and kind of made things happen, right? So schools basically shut down physically, but they opened their online modes, and literally that mode of delivery moved online. But now, as the second round of lockdowns are coming in place, and even in countries that they aren't, schools have to think about how they can manage this more efficiently, right? So, for example, in the past, you could just use some of the online web applications to try and deliver, but teachers have to struggle in trying to think about how the lesson creation and delivery is going to work. There were forums that were created; they exchanged a lot of feedback on those forums, etc. But now, with the second wave, I suspect that same energy is not going to exist, and that parents are going to want to see more structure. Teachers are going to need more help, and so a lot of the schools and some of the big change that we see have been implementing systems and processes in place to prepare for that in the future. But there are some of the standalone operators who are probably still not in a good place with that perspective, and that's going to probably be a big challenge for them to in the current phase and going forward.
Ashwin, we've talked about the challenges, and we've just started starting to talk about how schools responded. What have you observed in terms of the different ways in which schools have responded in different regions, and in particular their level of innovation?
A lot of them have had to make it up as they've gone along. Some of them have said, we've been investing in education technology for the longest time, but the truth is that has been focused on using technology to deliver classroom learning, which is great. But how do you suddenly deal with the fact that you've got 20 kids sitting at home, potentially with not the greatest access to a quiet space or even a device sometimes, and working with other people around them. And I think the schools have done pretty well in terms of, initially the parents felt that there was a lot of pressure on them, and they were being asked to deliver what the teacher should have been doing. And it felt much more like remote learning. Send some worksheets in, do it, and hand it back. I think over the last few months, what it's turned out to be, it's much more an online product. I think folks have spent the summers really working hard with their teachers, and I'm really impressed with some of the schools that we've worked with in terms of how they've migrated from just remote learning, distance learning, to an actual online product. And I think some of the things that I've seen is the sharing of best practice. Now, this is one of many, many webinars that are happening, but we've been fortunate enough to participate in a number of webinars where the private schools are sharing their experiences with state schools or with government, whether it's around online learning or how to deal with health and safety. So I think there's been a lot of sharing of best practice, people banding together. There's a lot of articles also being written that people can have access to. I think teachers are exchanging notes and working together and collaborating to come up with better solutions. And I think the focus has shifted from just pure, can we deliver the online, the school experience, to, well, what about the kind of more social, emotional aspects of school? How can we make sure that we can continue that? It's very difficult, but there's a lot being written about what's being lost when you're not able to teach in a classroom. But I think schools are doing a pretty good job in terms of trying to replace some of that. They're not all the way there, but they've made some really good strides in that direction.
Jonathan, are you proud of what you've achieved so far and how you've innovated? And was it a very big shift for you, actually?
Yes, to all of those questions, I think. I suspect if you asked all head teachers over the last 6 months, are they proud of what they've achieved? I think they are. They care about their communities, and I think that transition that Ashwin just mentioned there of at first making sure that students were learning something, to as time went by, making sure that they were learning something and that they were remaining connected, that they were having, there was a wider focus on well-being, on physical exercise. And I've got to say, to be fair, Cognita I think this is one of the areas where Cognita as a group excelled. Things like the Cognita home games allowed our students from across the world to compete with one another, and that sense of connectivity, I think, was one of the things that people realized a month or so into school closures. This is not sustainable. If we're going to be closed for a long period of time, we need to make sure our students are connected. So yes, I'm really proud. Was it a challenge? No doubt. I think that's certainly the case. And as has been touched on previously, I don't think that challenge is over. I think we're at probably stage 2. Stage 1 was getting students learning in some capacity. Stage 2 was sort of refining that. But I think there will be further lockdowns, and how we then manage that in terms of, and I don't want to go into too much to future questions, but how we manage it in terms of maintaining that connectivity, how we manage well-being. And I think the third one is that in terms of equity, if we are going to be demanding students are using devices, for example, how do we ensure that all students, not just in our school community, but the community wider, have the same access to that sort of learning? I think that is going to be one of the big challenges facing school leaders, governments, etc. That sense of equity of learning. If you've not got access to Wi-Fi, you've not got the right devices, how do you learn against somebody who has?
David, have all schools done well, and those who haven't, why is that?
It's a great question. I think much of it is contextual, and I think there are some schools that, for sure, have struggled more than others. For example, I'm in close contact with many schools in the African region, and many of those schools are coming out of a period of time where they were already affected by Ebola and that crisis, and had been in distance learning, and are now really struggling because expats are pulling families away again, and the resources are drained, and so on. The other way I'd answer that question perhaps is that idea of anti-fragile, and it's something I've been interested by Taleb's work on anti-fragile organizations. And essentially what he says is that there are some organizations and some physical structures, in fact, that actually get stronger through stress. And one of the things I've noticed is that, and I'm curious about, is there must be conditions by which some schools are actually coming out of this becoming stronger, and they are exhibiting this anti-fragile mode of operating. And I think that it's curious then to look at what are the conditions that make one school fragile and rigid and another school anti-fragile and able to flex those muscles and in fact come out stronger with a greater sense of community, a greater sense of positioning for the next era of education. And I think those schools broadly that have been quite structured and rigid and unable to adapt are probably the ones that maybe have become a bit fractured. That's an enormous generalization, but I'll throw it in there anyway.
Well, everybody's nodding at the use of that phrase anti-fragile. I must say it's a phrase I've never heard, but I love it. Ashwin, you definitely were nodding away there. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things that's probably worth discussing, we're talking about the learning experience and how kids are being impacted. But I think at the beginning of this, what we saw was how parents reacted, and parents felt actually quite shortchanged. And remember, what many of the expat parents that schools are dealing with in international markets are parents that have come from the UK and have actually just been very happy with the state system. So when they land up in Dubai or Singapore or Hong Kong, sort of thinking, wow, we're paying a lot of money for the school, and suddenly this whole thing's online, or it's distance, and I'm having to do a lot of the work, and I've got pressure on my job with the pandemic, and the school's asking me to pay full fees. right? And I think the schools that have been, good in terms of delivering content and looking after their kids is one thing, but some of the schools have done a really good job of explaining why it is that fees can't actually be reduced, because the economics of running a school are very simple. 60 to 70% of your operating costs are teachers. And the last thing that you need at this stage is to try and cut teacher costs, because that will really impact the quality of delivery. So I think the schools that did really well, that were flexible, would say, look, if you are a parent that's having a problem with paying for the fees, there is some fee support. We can help you. But then some of the parents said, well, we want a blanket discount, right? And I remember there's an article written in Dubai where someone said, well, paying full fees for my school is the equivalent of paying for a 5-star meal at a 5-star restaurant, but having a takeaway, which I think is a little bit of a strained analogy, because the precise thing is teachers are working harder than they've ever worked, and so is the school, and they're getting technology and built into the system. They're procuring new software platforms. They're spending more money actually to deliver online. So I think blanket discounts, which is something that parents were asking for, is probably not a fair way to go. But there is a halfway house where the best schools, the really good schools that were able to be flexible and not rigid, were the ones that were able to sit down with parents and explain how schools really work. And I think that's something that parents going forward, as if we go into further lockdowns, need to understand.
Is that something that you did, Jonathan? What was your relationship like with your parents when this all started kicking off?
We're quite a small school, and I think one of the strengths of the school is the sense of community. And what we said was that we didn't feel it was necessarily right to offer a blanket discount, although ultimately we offered a rebate on fees for the following year. But what we said was that we would ring fence 10% of that term's fees for members of the community who'd been adversely affected by COVID. So who lost their job or were put on the equivalent of furlough. And I think the fact that the parents saw that the school wasn't doing this just to make more money, to rip their parents off, and was genuinely supporting the members of the community who'd been affected, it was very well received. And I had only one parent who wrote to me unhappy with the position we'd taken. So I think it was two things. One, it was that sense of emphasizing the community. And I think the second thing is what I've learned throughout this, or what has been reinforced more than anything else, is that communications are critical. Comms with the staff, comms with the parent body, probably more than anything else, have determined the success or otherwise of the action we've taken. And I think parents generally have valued that we've communicated with them regularly, kept them informed, and solicited their opinions. So I think that ties in with what we're saying about the fees. It's the position we take, but also the communication with them.
Yeah. Jayne, I wonder if I can just finish this topic of this phrase anti-fragile. Is that something that you've observed in looking across schools and how they've responded? Have some of them, in fact, become stronger?
Absolutely. And absolutely. I think firstly, that's a great phrase. And, when we look at the K-12 school system globally, at least in the international school segment, that's definitely true. And I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So when you see how schools have functioned across academic years, and there's schools have just entered a new academic year, and if you see the kind of numbers that they have reported on their enrollment numbers, they've pretty much been able to either stay at the levels that they were at pre-COVID or had very minor declines. Now, this is an exceptional year. And if schools are able to do that, they kind of demonstrate the fact that the offering is robust. Parents have definitely been happy about the fact that their children during the lockdown have been able to continue their education and not lose a year. And if you compare and contrast this with some of the other education segments, so whether it's after-school tutoring or English language learning, etc., their providers and operators have been impacted much, much more, right? So when we just generally talk about the overall school business, I think it's demonstrated that globally. But I think one point that I would like to add there about it's still early days, right? So education technology is supposed to be the great leveler or the great enabler, right, to access and quality education. But perhaps one of the challenges is that in the segment that we are talking about, which is international schools, they are generally very high quality institutions with very high quality teachers, and they have been able to adapt to technology very well. And as a result of that, demonstrate some of the resilience that we are talking about. But as you start going down the curve, even sometimes to the public institutions or schools that are not as high quality, they have definitely faced a lot of challenges in trying to make that shift to online. And that whole adage about is education technology going to be the great leveler, perhaps has worked in the other way. So it's almost like two segments. So the segment that we're talking about that's relevant for our discussion today, definitely it's demonstrated that. But I think it's still early days, and we have to see the impact on education when you look at the broader set of students, how they have been impacted. And I suspect that we'll find that some of the public school systems or schools that didn't have the kind of resources that some of the high quality schools had, they perhaps suffered a bit more.
Mm. David, you mentioned Ebola and the impact that had on education in Africa. Are there any lessons that have been learned from that experience?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that I'm observing, and I work in a relatively large international school of around 1,400 students. So we've been 70 years around now. So we're large, traditional in many ways, and I think one of the things that you look to some of the smaller schools in the region of Africa, and having spoken with many heads in that region over the last few months, what you can learn is that some of those, because of the particular lessons and experiences that those schools have faced, is that you can learn a lot from their agility and their adaptability and their style of leadership that has, in a sense, been traditionally the big international schools have looked to support and serve smaller schools around the world. And I think we're seeing almost the reverse now, that actually smaller schools, maybe more niche schools, have a lot to teach some of the more the larger organizations, the networks, and some of the kind of bigger players in the industry. And that, I think that idea of the niche school may be one that begins to flourish more and more as we move into a new period where the kind of schools that we need today might be different to how they need to be in 2 years, and again different in 5 years. And that's a big ask when you're looking at the big institutions. And it's much easier for smaller schools in some respects to adapt and reallocate and change. And yet they have their own pressures because they're often, it's coupled with a lack of resources on the other side and a lack of capital in many cases to fall back on if you have a downturn in income, for example.
Interesting. I've made a note of that for us to cover when we talk about the future in our final topic. I wonder if we can move on to that word leadership now, which a few of you have mentioned. What is the mark of good leadership in this crisis? Jonathan, I wonder if I can start with you. And you're going to go, me.
No, most certainly not. In fact, my message is almost the opposite. That I was reading an article recently in International School Leader magazine, and Liz Free had written something about the whole concept of service leadership, which was important previously and has become even more important, I think, during this, that the sense that school leaders and leadership teams are very much needed to serve their communities during this crisis. Just to give you some examples of that, many parents in international schools, by definition, don't necessarily speak the local language, are not integrated and familiar with local practices and legislation, and are looking to schools to provide them with guidance above and beyond school matters, but to keep them up to date with as I say, guidance on health and safety or whatever else. I think teachers have found this incredibly challenging in terms of, as I say, not just uncertainty, but on the international scene, they're often away from their family. They're feeling more isolated, more disconnected. And I think schools have had a really vital role to play in being a support mechanism for their staff, for their wider families. So I think in terms of the leadership, it is the sort of the pedagogical leadership has remained. And I think it's the best leaders have recognized that we just can't go on with business as usual. I've been on a crash course over the last 6 months about digital learning, like I imagine many heads have. But I think where my efforts have been most needed and made most impact is actually around reassurance, providing opportunities for connectivity, keeping people informed. And I think that has been, and I think, to be honest with you, I think international schools have really stepped up very well and done that extremely well from what I've seen. But I think that's where we've been needed.
David, what about you? Would you also put, as Jonathan's just mentioned again, communication there as one of the key leadership tools that's needed right now?
Yeah, the two words that were coming to mind are the two ideas. One was focus, and retaining focus on what it is that we're trying to do. And often that takes us back to our mission, what we believe about learning, and retaining that focus on learning and the well-being of the community. The other, though, is maybe to expand a little bit more, is something I think about just managing complexity. And I think that's a big part of the leadership role, is to manage that complexity. And if you allow me, I'll throw another idea into the conversation. And it's one I came across a few weeks ago over the summer around Jardin's principle. And he, it's an idea, its author really is suggesting that, everything in life begins with a level of naivety, becomes complex, and ultimately we come to a point of simplicity and perspective. And the problem with this principle, as the author suggests, is that we're somewhere on a journey from naivety to simplicity. And we know it's going to get complex, but we never know quite where we are along that line. And so the problem is, we think things were complex, or we thought things were complex back in March or April. But little did we know how complex they were really going to be. And actually, when we look back, we start saying, you know what, we may have been a bit naive about one or two things. And I think the challenge of leadership is knowing that, in a sense, you're trying to lead people through a crisis that is going to get complicated before it gets simple again. And yet, as a leader, you know as much as anybody else, you're never quite sure how far along the journey it's going to be. You are, and whether we're just getting going. And I think this is one of the challenges of leadership right now.
Ashwin, what's your perspective on what good leaders look like at the moment? Is it about focus? Is it dealing with complexity? Is it communication? Or is it all of those things?
I think it's all of those things. But I think the thing that I've seen with school leaders through this pandemic, some have taken the view that well, I'm the CEO of the school group. I need to have all the answers, and I'm going to be the guy who gets everything done, right? But I've seen some great leaders who've said, look, this is all new to all of us. I don't know the answers, but I'm going to try and work it out, and I'm going to work with my team. And then I'm going to make sure that each of the people that I work with become leaders in their own right. So, not micromanaging things at any kind of school level, letting the headmasters be the front face of all the communications to their parents, right? I mean, some CEOs have felt that they have to communicate with the parents directly. But others have said, look, the headmaster should do it. And great headmasters have actually said, look, who do the parents really kind of identify with? It's their class teachers. So class teachers have taken a much more of a leadership role and talked to parents, liaised with them, understood the issues, and then filtered it up within the organization to make the right decisions. So I think that the best leaders have had the humility to understand that they don't have all the answers, enabled the people that are working with them to be leaders in their own right, and take a bigger role in running and managing the school and managing all the different stakeholders. And this is not just about students, right? This is about the parents, and it's about the teachers and the other folks that work in a school. So I think those are the really successful leaders that I've seen through the last 3 or 4 months.
Jayne, that sounds to me like great leadership in any context, not just education. Is there anything that you have identified as being specific to education and schools?
Yeah. No, I think firstly, a lot of great points being talked about there. And is it about focus? Is it about communication? Is it about delegation at the right time? I think it's definitely a mix of all those issues. But just to contextualize it from a school perspective, great leaders, there are multiple stakeholders in a school that they need to manage, right? And they either, sometimes when they make a mistake, they either tend to focus on, for example, investors or school owners, or they can focus just on the school teachers or parents or just students, right? But there are multiple stakeholders that are involved. And I suspect that there is a different answer to a great leader in each of the different settings. And it's a mix of all those points, right? So the great leaders need to be able to take all the stakeholders with them together in the journey, ensuring that their needs are being met. The community, they have a good connection with the community. Parents are comfortable with what the school is trying to do and are sure that their children are safe in the school. Teachers are taken care of in this very, very tough time for them, right? It's a lot of hard work that they're putting in, and so I suspect it's also a mix of all of that. So there's just one more element I would like to add, which is basically balance, right? Like, how do you balance the needs of different stakeholders while you do all of those other things that we talk about, like communication, focus, and delegation.
Yeah. Somebody earlier, I can't remember who it was now, to use the phrase about what's being lost from the school experience. I wonder if we can touch on that briefly, because I think most of you are saying that most schools have got the curriculum issues solved. But what is being lost when children are either doing blended learning or are doing remote learning? And are some schools compensating for that better than others? Who would like to lead on that? Who's got a thought on that?
I mean, being a parent and just associating with what we see in the market also, I think from a curriculum perspective, definitely schools have been able to do a fairly good job in trying to keep up pace with the annual curriculum, ensuring that learning is progressing. It's difficult to measure just the outcomes of that as yet, but I think schools have been able to do a fairly good job in that. But there are, so many different angles when you talk about education, not just the curriculum and literacy, right? So, for example, if you look at extracurriculars that students used to participate in, whether it's music or it's sports, they have not been able to participate in many of those activities. And even if schools have opened, because of social distancing norms, they perhaps cannot, for example, play musical instruments because of the fear of spreading the disease, or go to swimming pool and participate there. Similarly, social interaction among students, right? And there is so much of safeguarding that's being implemented, which perhaps hampers the normal level of social interaction that students would have had if the current situation was not. I think that those are some of the aspects that are getting lost. And from what we see, schools are definitely trying to make efforts around that. So, for example, if we talk about some of the PE kind of activities, sports, etc., schools are encouraging students and parents to participate in those activities together, maybe go out hiking, cycling, or going for a jog, record that and send it in. So schools are trying to take measures and steps to enable that. But I think there's something there, that gets lost in the softer part of the education rather than the just pure play curriculum aspect.
Yeah. Jonathan, what are you doing to compensate for that?
Firstly, I totally agree. I think the academic side has been good. I think it's the social interactions, particularly that are missing. Younger generations today, they're incredibly tactile. They see their friends who they've not seen for 30 minutes and they have to give them a hug.
30 minutes? Make it 5.
That's probably a very positive thing compared to when I was at school. But they obviously miss that when they're distant. So I mentioned earlier, I think there's that whole connectivity, and along with that, physical activity is schools will increasingly need to do. And I think being part of a group, in my case, has helped. We've done things through the school. We've also put on wider events with other schools in the Cognita group, where the students feel that they are doing fun activities that are wider than themselves. I think this sense of not feeling that they are alone, isolated, and that their life is going on as normally as it can, I think is the key thing. And just a final point on this, I think there's and perhaps we'll come on to it in the future, but I think for teachers, they've had to reskill quite dramatically. One of the staff here wrote a brilliant article for Tess about how she'd have to adapt her teaching, that teaching online was totally different because she wasn't able to pick up the same signals that she'd done otherwise. And I think somebody said to me recently, teachers have been trained to drive a car, and now somebody's asking them to drive a 10-ton lorry. And it's the same fundamentals, but it's a different skill. And I think the better teachers are learning to pick up other signals than they would normally do in terms of when a student might be feeling low, might be struggling with work, or just need to do something. So I think teachers have a key role to play in maintaining the non-academic side of things.
Yeah, and it's often, isn't it, that casual comment that can make a difference to a child. I know certainly with adults who are not physically in the workplace with their leaders and managers. You know, the moment when that person says, "Oh, Susan, that email that you wrote to client X was really good." It takes 5 seconds. That has boosted that individual. That's leadership, isn't it? And all of that is lost because you're not going to set up a Zoom call, are you, to make that 5-second comment? And I'm guessing that the same thing is happening with teachers and passing a child in the corridor and mentioning that good piece of work. David, what do you think is being lost, and how can schools get better at compensating?
I think one of the things we've learned is that learning, I mean, years ago, we may have thought that the future was all going to be about online learning, and we could kind of bulldoze our schools and move swiftly into that future. If we've learned anything over the last 6 months, it's that learning is integrally connected to physical space. And that physical space is about community. I think that there are many students and many members of the community who would look back, as we all do on our lives, and say we may all have lost something through this pandemic. And some of those losses are big losses and some of those are small losses. And I think at the same time, I would say that it's interesting to look at, if you look at a broad cross-section of students, we can probably all identify students, some of whom have gained from the experience of digital learning or remote distance learning, whatever we call it, because a different kind of structure maybe is more suited to their way of learning as learners. And yet I think even they would say, but it's still not the same. And one of the things that makes me think is it raises a question about, and this actually, I think we've almost lost sight of this as in schools right now, is, so what are schools for? Because if it's just the product at the end, the ticket into university, the future happiness and wealth of the population, that maybe we can get away with an online program. But I think one of the things we're learning is that actually it's the journey. Schools are life, and it's the journey that maybe people are feeling that sense of, we just didn't have that chance, in the same way as we might say, we're living our lives, but we're not able to travel. It's that sense of journeying that maybe some of our students are feeling they've lost. And one trick to kind of thinking our way into that might be to say, if you ever speak to a student who is 5 or 10 or 20 years out of school, you ask them one question: what still remains? What still remains? And almost invariably what you find is that the thing that has marked them and carried them forward in their life will be almost invariably it's about that one teacher, that kind word. It's about sitting on the steps of the building waiting for parents to pick me up. It's about the game. The memories that we have about school are that are taking us forward and driving us through our lives are not the academic proficiencies that we sometimes think is the real product of education.
Fascinating. Let's go on all day talking about this, because there's so much there, isn't there? I think that idea, what are schools for, it's a very powerful question. Ashwin, what's your observation about how some schools are doing this well and others not? And can you also touch on this sense of this word community, because it's come up a lot, and we're talking obviously about community within the school, but also the school's role within the wider community.
Yeah, and it's tough when you can't. It's tougher to play a role in the community when you haven't got that parents picking up the kid, parents dropping the child. It's interesting. Parents find it really strange that many schools in markets like China and Dubai and Singapore have a parents' cafe in the school, where it's actually the parents' space to get together. It's something that at least I haven't seen very much of in the UK.
Never heard of it.
And it's really part of creating the school to be an integral part of the community. And I think, look, it's very tempting to say, oh, let's do a Zoom call for all the parents to get together, but people don't want that. People are fed up. So what I've seen some schools do well is just a teacher who's close to some of especially the younger kids, where online is really hard to deliver on. They will arrange a time and a date to come and visit the child at home and do a sort of one-to-one, not teaching, but just engaging with them, right? And they'll bring them a soft toy, or they'll bring them something that says that we're still together. We may only see each other on a computer screen, but you're part of my class. And again, letting the teachers represent the school and be the front face of the school, be the leaders in the parents and the students' eyes. And I think, it's not a question that you've asked me, but we talked about the things that that we're missing. Right. But I think, to build on David's point, one of the great things that have come out of this whole pandemic is that people recognize the importance of the bricks and mortar school and the value of teachers. Right? Anyone who's tried to spend even 30 minutes trying to teach long division to whatever, a 9-year-old will recognize what teachers do is noble, it's difficult, and yeah, they have slightly longer summer holidays than the rest of us, but they deserve it.
They deserve it. Ashwin, is it long division that you have a particular problem with, or would you be better with French vocab?
Anything that's analytical is always difficult for me. So yeah, but it is because we're so used to it's all automatic in our heads, right? And the inquisitiveness of children, which is exactly what you're trying to inculcate, it can sometimes be very frustrating for a parent to deal with. So I think, we need, after this, when this thing is over, we need to really value our teachers and reward them and really celebrate them. And I think this is a wake-up call to all of us. I mean, governments all across the world for years have been talking about, we need to recruit better folks into the teaching profession. We need to value them. We need to reward them. We need to recognize them. Well, I think now parents will see the importance of that, and I think it's something that should come out of this terrible period.
Yeah, and to see your child skipping into school and saying how much my daughter's 15, how much she's looking forward to going to school is a thing of great joy. I hope that they, as well as governments, will continue to value what they've got there. Fiona, what were you going to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say we've been having very many contributions from schools and also the wider relocation support network of saying the things that they have done to engage families and engage the schools. So, just having informal get-togethers, as Ashwin was saying, PTA-type quizzes and all sorts of fun stuff. But equally, the relocation professionals have been organising get-togethers for all those international families as well, to sort of share in special celebrations in different countries around the world. And indeed, one of the schools, International School of London, they were doing their bilingual and multilingual classes for parents just to keep up, which they do regularly anyway. But that's the sort of offering where parents can come together as well. Mm. And of course, the global mobility, you mentioned it a little bit earlier on about this managing complexity. Well, a lot of the parents are in this world of they know it's complex. Anyway, in some ways, they're accustomed to dealing with those sorts of complexities. So these sorts of incidents, we've never had anything quite like the pandemic impacting, really the whole world. But there have been health incidents, there's been political unrest, there's been various other natural disasters. And people who move a lot and or work in an international context are used to that sort of thing. And I think there's been a lot more sharing schools, sharing with the parents sharing with the wider world, and this sense of collaboration. I think hopefully that will continue. And certainly both of you mentioned that collaboration was important in your schools, but it certainly comes across as something that people have been telling us.
Mm. What sort of collaboration are you talking about there, Jonathan? How has it helped your network?
I think there's been two aspects to collaboration. One, sort of within the group of schools that I work for, Cognita. We have schools in Asia. They were obviously ahead of us in terms of the pandemic hitting. So that was really useful just in terms of practical advice and lessons to learn. A very specific example, they said, I spoke to 2 or 3 heads there, and they all said the message from the teachers was, be careful about how much work you provide for online learning, because we provided too much. And on day one, all the parents said, whoa, there's too much. So just some very practical advice. In Switzerland itself, I've been really impressed with the extent to which heads have collaborated. I speak regularly with the heads of the other international schools in Zurich. And over the weekend, there was a good exchange for heads across Switzerland that has led to the setting up of a spreadsheet where we all put in, whether we're doing online learning for each stage, are we wearing what we're doing in regard to masks, what we're doing in regard to transport services, extracurricular activities, etc. Because as I touched on in my very first answer, uncertainty and the lack of a template here is one of the challenges. So to at least know in terms of the pandemic hitting, so that was really useful just in terms of practical advice and lessons to learn. A very specific example, they said, I spoke to 2 or 3 heads there, and they all said the message from the teachers was, be careful about how much work you provide for online learning, because we provided too much. And on day one, all the parents said, whoa, there's too much. So just some very practical advice. In Switzerland itself, I've been really impressed with the extent to which heads have collaborated. I speak regularly with the heads of the other international schools in Zurich. And over the weekend, there was a good exchange for heads across Switzerland that has led to the setting up of a spreadsheet where we all put in, whether we're doing online learning for each stage, are we wearing what we're doing in regard to masks, what we're doing in regard to transport services, extracurricular activities, etc. Because as I touched on in my very first answer, uncertainty and the lack of a template here is one of the challenges. So to at least know what other schools are doing and how they're approaching this is very reassuring. And I think one of the really good things to come out of this, and this has been talked about a lot when I have conversations with heads, is I think the sense of collaboration and exchange has been dramatically strengthened, and I really hope it continues going forward.
Is that sort of thing going on in Belgium, David?
Yeah, I mean, a very similar picture here, and it made me think. It was a few months ago, at the beginning of this pandemic, I wrote a blog, and it was called "It's Time to All Start Copying One Another." People took it seriously as well, and the point was really that there are a number of things that we do, irrespective of the competitive nature of our business in some parts of the world or some cities, that we have a moral and ethical responsibility to share. And in fact, we don't need to all reinvent the wheel for our own school. And this is one of the complex problems of being in the education business, is that every school, in a sense, has a danger of being an island unto itself. And then that sharing will actually enable us to perhaps concentrate on the well-being of our students far more efficiently. And I remember in those early days in February, March, we were taking matrices from different schools and reopening plans and using work that other people had done as a basis for our work. And then other people took our work and used it as a basis for their work. And I do think those are the kinds of really strong collaborative things that we can do across the world where we can support one another, because we are all in this together in the end.
You've mentioned a word that I wanted to bring up anyway, which is well-being. Obviously, a big concern for all of us involved with, whether it's with our own children or in the education business. How well do you think schools in general are taking care of the mental well-being of students, and who shines particularly brightly? Have you got any examples for us, Jayne?
I think that's, it's definitely, the second part of the question is a very tough question to answer. Who shines particularly brightly? All our clients have definitely, and which includes, companies such as a school company such as Cognita or, Inspired, ISP, Non-Anglia, etc. They, I think, being at the position that they're in, they have definitely invested a lot behind the well-being of students and also parents, right? So, and what do I mean by that? So during the entire pandemic, there was a lot of extra emphasis that was taken or put in place to ensure that parents were tuned in to the developments that were happening. There was very, very effective communication. Parents knew in advance what the plans were. Like, one of the biggest complaints of parents with schools that didn't do it well was not knowing what the schedule, for example, for their children is going to be like in the coming week, or if homework was sent to them and they actually, which required them to print out a copy so that their children could do that homework, but the format that it was sent to them in was not conducive for that, or they didn't have a printer at home, right? Like, there were basic issues like that caused a lot of angst for parents when they were trying to manage their daily routines, work life, routine at home, etc. I think definitely most of the international schools and the big groups invested very heavily in ensuring that they spent a lot of time over communicating, which is perhaps key to one of the key things to managing well-being amongst both the stakeholders, parents and students. And they did a fairly good job of it, considering the situation that we were all in.
Mm. What about your school, Jonathan? What percentage of your time has been invested in taking care of the mental well-being of not just the students, obviously, but teachers and parents as well?
What I would say on this is that what we found is that there's no one template. So, for example, we have a primary campus and a secondary campus, and we found that during the initial lockdown, the things we set up for the primary in terms of their opportunities to collaborate and continue to be engaging with one another were really popular and really well used. And the same approach in the secondary was, it just wasn't taken up in the same way. So I think the first thing to say is that there's not necessarily one approach to this that works or doesn't. I think I received a really good email on Sunday from a school in Zurich, from the head, and I thought she summed it up really well in terms of her leadership. She didn't mention the word leadership or talk about herself, but she talked about the approach in school, where she said, we've been emphasizing to staff that this is a marathon, not a sprint. We can't burn ourselves out. We've been emphasizing that illness, and even more serious than illness on occasion, is going to be perhaps more common and more part of everyday life than it was previously. And we need to brace our students for that, and we need to brace ourselves for that colleagues, students, families are going to get ill. And it was just almost a philosophical approach of how are we going to position ourselves and what messages are we going to prioritize during this pandemic, rather than we're going to do this activity or that activity. And I thought it was a really impressive sort of approach to leadership and what she decided was important in her school. So, yeah, I don't know the precise percentage of what I've done, but I think I've had to think about staff well-being and, to an extent, parental well-being as much as student well-being as ever. I think that's been more a part of my job than ever before.
Have you found as well, David, that it needs a tailored approach according to different types of student and different ages in particular?
Yeah, inevitably, in the sense that I think well-being is probably what we mean by it is several things. First of all, it's about making sure that the health and safety protocols in the school are in place, that they are that we reduce the impact of community transition of COVID-19, etc. Beyond that, as people have said, I think one of the underlying tones that as we move 6, 7, 8 months into this crisis is that the strain is beginning to show. We are seeing this from teachers, from members of staff, from parents, from students, that there was a certain energy back in those first lockdown days where people were being creative and in a sense finding ways to move with agility, and there is no doubt that the aspects of that energy are now depleted, and there's been lots written about our surge capacity right now is depleted. So we don't, as human beings, have that ability to kind of move into that creative phase. And so I think underpinning that, we probably are now looking at a situation where there are things that we see in terms of the stresses and strains around us, but there's probably a lot going on underneath that all of us are feeling that we may not see for another year or 2 years. And that's probably where the biggest dangers lie, is in the unseen stress that people are living with. as this pandemic continues.
Can I just jump in on the back of something there? I agree wholly that there was an energy. I think that's the right word in the first wave, if you want to call it that. I was speaking to a head in Spain last week or the week before, and he was saying that a vast majority of his parents, or a significant majority of his parents, are connected one way or another to the tourist industry, and they had enough reserves of cash to sort of see through the first closure, the first lockdown. And as we touched on earlier, there wasn't a particular drop in number of pupils in international schools. And his point was that that's because people relied on those reserves. And now a second wave, they just won't be able to cope. And he is very, very worried that his community is going to be decimated. And I think that is one of the huge challenges we've got in almost the second wave. People thought this was a one-off hump. They rose to the challenge. They fell back on things in a way they just won't be able to do in the second time around. And I think that is going to present enormous challenges for many international schools. And I think in particular locations, it's going to be dramatic.
So resources of energy and also financial resources.
Indeed.
So you have, thank you, segued beautifully into looking at the future. So let's look at the medium-term future. So getting over this second hump and perhaps a third, who knows, but also a little bit longer term. How do you see things evolving for international schools in, say, the next 5 years? Let's start. Actually, you kicked us off, Ashwin, with your analysis of the position and what parents are considering right now when they look at a school. How do you see that changing in say 5 years' time?
Yeah, I'm not one for crystal ball gazing, because I always tend to get it wrong. But actually, I think we're going to learn what was really good about what we had, and we'll learn to appreciate what we had in terms of schooling. I think we will, as I said, I think one of the things, we will value teachers more. I'm hoping that we will work out a way to reward and recognize them more. I think the infrastructure of school, when it's built going forward, will accommodate the fact that there may be another pandemic. And what, like schools have been built to ensure that they're fire safe and safe from for a whole bunch of reasons. They will also be designed now in a way that they are pandemic safe, so you can social distance. There is enough space for you to manage through another pandemic. I think schools will focus much more on pastoral care and the focus on student well-being, but also teacher and parent well-being. I mean, if you look at a government like Dubai, they started their happiness survey, their student happiness survey, about 3 or 4 years ago. They were way ahead of everyone. They were thinking about student well-being. In markets like the UK, the US, people are publishing academic outcomes, how well the school has done, university destinations. The KHDA have their own audit facility in terms of academic quality. But they've also been focusing on this, and I hope that other governments and big school operators, and Cognita have started doing that, will focus on the mental health aspect and take a temperature check on that. And I think, of course, technology will become more pervasive and used more widely, but along with the teacher. So this idea, and I know some futurists, as they like to call themselves, think about a world where education will be delivered through an iPad and everything will be online. But I think one thing this pandemic has taught us is the way that my grandparents learned, which is teacher, classroom, blackboard, is not going to be very different from the way my grandchildren will learn, which is teacher-led. Some of the pedagogical approaches will change, but going into school, being part of a community, benefiting from all of the things that we've just discussed is important. So I think a lot of the things will remain, but some of the things around the way we treat teachers, the way we value pastoral care, the way we construct our schools, and the use of technology will be the things that will hopefully change.
Jayne, what do you see as being the value proposition that schools will have to offer in, say, 5 years' time?
Right, absolutely. I think that's a very interesting question. There's definitely technology. I mean, I don't want to belittle the role of technology in the future. I definitely agree with everything that's been said about schools are here to stay. The brick and mortar institutions, they add so much value to the student, parent, and the community and it's not only about learning, right? So that they are going to stay here for the future. But considering that for the first time globally, technology has become as pervasive as it has. And if anything that the pandemic has taught us is that it can play some kind of a role in delivery of education. I think there's going to be a move towards incorporating more technology within the classroom, right? Perhaps in homework assistance, the schools are going to stay, but just incorporating more technology in the classroom. And what that will mean is that schools will need to start thinking about from just health and safety to also things like safeguarding children as they go online. Teachers are going to have to retrain themselves and think about how they can manage lesson creation and delivery in the classroom if every student is going to have a device in the classroom. Content creators are going to have to think about if the regular textbook is going to slowly become less and less redundant, how to think about content design so that it can actually enable better education in the classroom. Individualized learning and such aspects like that are going to become more and more prevalent going forward in the future. So I definitely think 5 years on the line, schools will need to do all those things that Ashwin said about being designed for the future, be pandemic proof, but schools and governments are going to invest behind technology. And how does that really translate into better academic quality delivery and better integration among students and overall better learning for students is going to be a quite important metric that they'll be measured by.
Mm. Jonathan, what you told us about your colleague in Spain was frankly rather depressing. What do you see when you look into the future? Will many schools not survive?
I think potentially location will become important, but I think one of the things here that is really interesting for the future of international schooling is perhaps my Anglo-centric view, but when we think about international schooling, we tend to think first and foremost of English curriculum. British schools are a big part of the market. And I think one of the fascinating things looking forward into this, and I agree that everything that Jayne and Ashwin had said about how individual schools might change in the schooling system. I think one of the fascinating things for this is what we might call the West has handled this pandemic really badly. And I think its reputation will rightly take a bit of a battering. And if you fast forward that, if you are in Vietnam, if you are in parts of the Middle East, and you're looking at this and thinking, what is it that's making it so attractive to put my son or daughter into this international school? And the growth of international schools has been fueled by the local market, particularly in China. And I actually wonder whether here this might be a dent to the meteoric growth of international schools. And if I'm perfectly honest, I think that might not be a bad thing. So in terms of the future of the schooling, if we fast forward it to a long lens rather than a short lens, I think it may cause a rethink in the value of and the nature of international schooling, full stop.
Mm. David, earlier on, you talked about niche schools and that you felt perhaps this was their time. What's your perspective on the future?
I've been known to say the words, I believe in the end of international education. And what I mean by that is because I do believe in the end of international education, in the sense that if we go back 100 years, it was a concept that didn't exist. So if we are looking 80, 100 years in the future, we can reasonably suggest that it won't exist in the future. There's no reason to assume that it will. Education and learning has continued for many thousands of years. But I think that's to say that I think in some context, one of the things we can look at this debate and discussion and is say the arrival of international education as we have traditionally known it was because companies were moving away from certain parts of the world and moving their employees and families to other locations. And I think one of the things this pandemic is showing companies is that maybe you don't need such global mobility, and it actually provides there's some other mechanisms that are being discovered. And I think where this takes me is to a question of international education in some form or another may exist, but for those of us who work in big traditional international schools that have been around for 60, 70 years, we are the ones potentially that are most at risk, because so much of our business is based upon that global mobility of families and the link with the big corporations. And I think one of the things I would say is that if I was to push into the future, I think there are some interesting, future scenarios that we might want to look at. The OECD has just published an updated set of 4 future scenarios for the role of education in society. And I think some of those are beginning to link us to a redefinition of what the role of schools will be in society. And one of the things that I think is most interesting in one of those scenarios is this idea of learning on the go. And we're seeing this in university education. The idea that you go to university at 18 and you finish at 21 is dead. That idea will fade out over the next 10 to 20 years. And universities know that. Schools, I think, are beginning to know that, but that changes our product drastically. And these are the kinds of important questions that I think schools have to now wrestle with, even if they're trying to steady the ship in the current pandemic.
Thank you. Fiona, I wonder if I can give the final word to you and your perspective on the medium and long-term future.
Well, I think the international schools are obviously doing a great job, and the ones that we speak to are very dynamic and innovative. I think in the long term, there's great potential for the workforces and the employers of the future and to exist now to engage more with schools and with higher education to really be shaping what the future of careers and jobs is all about, and what is going on in different countries and regions, and why people are going there, and what the supply chains are, and what's the change in these different industry sectors, and sort of be part of the solution to that as well. And I think there's a lot of work to be done about explaining this huge growth in international schools, but what's going on in countries and in regions, and the quality of education, which is primarily for the local population, and that is steaming ahead, and that companies can learn from that, and so can other parts of the world. So I think there's going to be positives to come out of it as well. And some of these topics that we've touched on will be drilling down to with shorter sessions throughout our fair here. And we would encourage people, if they've got a thought leadership piece or they want to do a little 5-minute video with their views, let's get these conversations going. And I do appreciate, thank you very much for all of your wonderful contributions. It's been fascinating discussion.
It has indeed, yes. Let me also thank our guests, Ashwin, Jitin, Jonathan and David, for your time. I'm sure that everybody watching has found that both stimulating, thought-provoking and practically very helpful. I'm back tomorrow for another big event. We're going to be talking to Dr. Anisha Abraham. She's very recently written a book, Raising Global Teens. This is all about how we can help our teenagers navigate through social media, body image, stress, puberty, and of course the current pandemic. So do join us for that at 3:00. And there are lots of other ways that you can get involved, as you can see there with this month-long event. RelocateGlobal.com is the website, and there are wonderful guides, and there's the magazine. And as Fiona said, do also get involved and do offer some content, because this is very much a collaborative thing. It's a month-long conversation on this really important topic. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you again to my guests. Fiona, thank you for having us. I'll see you again before too long. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.